On September 4th, 1981, Jeff Slatten, 15, and his brother Tim, 12, were awakened by Lakeland, Florida police and informed that their mother, Linda Slatten, had been murdered. The police collected a rape kit and lifted a palm print from the windowsill where the killer had entered. Despite questioning numerous suspects, no one was charged, and the case went cold. Both before and after Linda Slatten's murder, Tim's football coach, Joe Mills, would regularly drive Tim to and from football practice. Coach Joe became a role model for the young boy who proudly displayed a football team photo in his room with Mills standing right behind him. For decades, Linda's sons lived in fear of the man they called the Monster. Nearly 40 years later, advancements in DNA technology identified Linda Slatten's likely killer, Coach Joe. Tim, who had looked up to Coach Joe, was shocked to learn that the man in the picture he had kept in his house for years was responsible for his mother's murder. Jeff described Coach Joe as a cold-hearted monster. On the morning of September 4th, 1981, Judy Butler, Linda's younger sister, walked 3 doors down to have a cup of coffee with Linda. When Linda didn't answer the door, Judy noticed that the screen was out of the window. Looking inside, she saw Linda's body lying crossways on the bed and began screaming. Police arrived to find the partially nude body of Linda Slatten, 31, with a wire coat hanger wrapped around her neck. The killer had entered through the open bedroom window. The sound of police radios woke up Linda's 15-year-old son, Jeff, who was sleeping on a cot in the living room. An officer told him to get dressed and go outside, ensuring he exited through the front door. Outside, Jeff saw numerous police officers, news crews, and his Aunt Judy crying. She informed him that his mother had been murdered, which he couldn't believe. In the second bedroom, another officer woke up Linda's younger son, Tim, then 12 years old, and told him to go outside with his brother without mentioning his mother. Tim wondered why the officer wasn't mentioning his mom and why a cop was waking him up. As Tim walked past his mother's closed bedroom door in his pajamas, it suddenly swung open as an officer left the room. Tim saw the entire crime scene, including his mother's bloody body with a coat hanger around her neck. This image still haunts him to this day. 7 years before the murder in 1974, Linda Slatten was a 24-year-old single mom who had just divorced Jeff and Tim's abusive father, Frank Slatten, after 9 volatile years of marriage. Jeff and Tim confirmed that their father was a violent alcoholic who hit their mother. In the following years, the young family struggled. Linda had difficulty finding work, made her own clothes to save money, and couldn't afford a car. When Tim needed a ride to football practice, Coach Joe would often pick him up along with some other boys. On September 3rd, 1981, the last full day of Linda's life, she and Jeff argued due to rising tensions with her teenage son. Jeff, angry and hungry, rode his bicycle 11 or 12 miles to his grandparents' house to get something to eat. At 8:30 that night, Tim came home from football practice, brought home by Coach Joe. Around 9 p.m., Linda took Tim to a party next door to play cards. Jeff's grandparents brought him home around 9 or 9:30 p.m. Linda and Tim came home about 11. By midnight, Jeff had made up with his mom and remembers their final moment together. As Linda washed dishes and prepared to go to her bedroom, Jeff told her, "I love you, Mom. I'll see you tomorrow." Former Sergeant Edgar Pickett, a legendary fingerprint expert with the Lakeland Police Department who led the crime scene unit, vividly remembers the Slatten case. He recalled going to the window where the killer entered, seeing the children asleep, and noticing the coat hanger around Linda's neck. The crime lab now bears his name, but this recognition was a long time coming. When Sergeant Pickett, then 53 and just a year away from retirement, arrived at the Slatten crime scene in 1981, his hard-earned reputation did not spare him from prejudice. Another detective told him that a black man don't have any business looking at a naked white woman, even though she was a homicide victim. Pickett believed that Linda Slatten had been strangled with a coat hanger from her own closet. He dusted most of the bedroom for fingerprints, including the floor, and found a crucial palm print on the windowsill. An autopsy later confirmed that Linda Slatten had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Swabs taken and preserved in a rape kit revealed the presence of semen. Throughout the morning, Pickett's thoughts kept returning to Linda's boys, as he had children of his own and was determined to solve the case. Standing at the spot where their lives changed forever, Jeff, who was 15 at the time, felt that his childhood ended the moment his Aunt Judy told him his mother had been murdered. In the hours following the murder on September 4th, 1981, Jeff and Tim Slatten faced a frightening world without their mother. Processing and dealing with the loss was hard for the 12 and 15-year-old boys. Jeff even contemplated suicide a couple of times, indicating the severity of his emotional struggle. After their mother's murder, the brothers moved in with their grandparents, Clarence and Margaret Harris. They stayed inside the house, scared to death to do anything. For the first terrifying days, the family slept in the same room, except for Grandpa Harris, who stood guard with a gun all night while they slept. The grandparents hoped that returning to familiar routines would help their distraught grandsons. A few weeks after their mom's funeral, the boys were back in school. Tim found comfort in being with friends and returning to football. His teammates, especially Coach Joe, were supportive and always rooting for him. Tim looked up to Coach Joe, who was his assistant football coach and would give him rides to games and practice. Tim's team football photo, taken just 1 month after the murder, hung in his bedroom. It reminded him of his mother's teachings to keep moving forward and never give up. Linda was a fighter, and despite her small stature, she was tough. Judy Butler, Linda's sister, noted that everyone who met Linda liked her, and many asked her out because she was young and pretty. However, when Linda met and married Frank Slatten, things changed. Judy described Frank as a mean, no-count scoundrel. The brothers said it was hard to know when their dad began to beat their mom, but the more he drank, the more violent he became. Jeff recalled an incident when he was just 6 or 7 years old, where he found his father holding a gun to his mother's head and tried to save her. Frank Slatten's history of abuse made him a person of interest for Lakeland detectives, but they seemed satisfied that he was home in Alabama on the night of the murder. Linda's boyfriend at the time of her death and other partygoers next door were also investigated, but no one was charged. The Lakeland Police Department frequently interrogated Jeff, taking him out of school for questioning. In the early days, it seemed that the police were most thorough in checking out Jeff, who, as a typical 15-year-old, had plenty of conflicts with his mom, including a heated argument on the last day of her life. The police put Jeff through a lie detector test, which he passed. However, they wanted to do it again and even suggested putting him under hypnosis. One cop told Jeff that he was strong enough to have strangled his mother, deeply hurting the grieving 15-year-old boy. Jeff's grandparents finally intervened, telling the police to leave the family alone and focus on finding their daughter's killer. 2 weeks later, according to the Lakeland police report, Jeff took a second polygraph test and was cleared. The investigation then slowed and eventually ground to a halt. As the years passed, Jeff and Tim started their own families but still carried the grief and guilt of not hearing anything on the night of their mother's murder and not being able to save her. They lived in fear of the man they called the Monster, knowing that unless he was dead, he was still out there somewhere. Around the 20th anniversary of their mom's murder, Jeff and Tim met with Lakeland detective Brad Grice, who was taking a fresh look at the case. Grice realized he had known Jeff for years through bowling. He took DNA samples from the brothers to clear them again and promised Jeff that he wouldn't retire until he solved his mother's case. Grice had already sent DNA from the Slatten rape kit to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDL. By March 1999, the FDL had developed a full DNA profile of Linda Slatten's anonymous killer. All they needed was a match in the database. Detective Grice took dozens of DNA samples from prior persons of interest, including the brothers' father, Frank Slatten, who had stopped drinking. None of the samples matched. In September 2001, Grice got a tip about a case from nearly a year after the Slatten killing, in which a 24-year-old man named Jimmy Ulmer had pulled a 10-year-old girl through her bedroom window and nearly killed her. Detective Grice learned that Jimmy Ulmer, who was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in prison for a savage assault on a 10-year-old girl nearly a year after the Slatten killing, had been staying with a friend in the same apartment complex as the Slattens around the time of Linda's murder. Grice felt strongly that Ulmer could be the perpetrator, but Ulmer had died in prison in 1996. Grice obtained a DNA sample from Ulmer's mother, hoping it would confirm his suspicions. However, the results showed that Ulmer was not a match, leaving Grice and the Slatten brothers discouraged and feeling like they were back to square one. By 2005, 24 years after the murder, Detective Grice was heading up a new cold case unit, and the FBI was continuously running the DNA profile of Slatten's killer through all federal databanks. Despite this, years passed without a match. Grice had a growing suspicion that the suspect might be deceased. He had made a promise to the brothers that he wouldn't retire until their mother's killer was caught, but due to medical issues, he was unable to keep that promise and retired in 2015. Jeff Slatten had started to come to terms with the possibility that he might never know who murdered his mother. However, 3 years later, there was renewed hope when a groundbreaking DNA technology began to gain traction in the law enforcement community. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore took on the Slatten case, determined to help the brothers find out who killed their mother. As a renowned expert in the field of investigative genetic genealogy, Moore believed that if DNA evidence was available, there was no reason the mystery could not be solved. C.C. Moore began her search for Linda Slatten's killer by uploading the anonymous DNA from Slatten's rape kit to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch. She then meticulously constructed the killer's genetic family tree, branch by branch. Moore built the family trees of people who shared DNA with the killer and identified common ancestors between them. She filled in the family tree with names by examining birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and social media, piecing together the puzzle piece by piece. Moore uncovered 3 genetic networks that ultimately narrowed down to one person most likely responsible for Linda Slatten's murder. The 3 genetic networks converged into one family tree, pointing to an immediate family with only one son. Since the killer was known to be male, it had to be him. After hundreds of leads and dead ends, and dozens of cleared suspects, C.C. Moore identified the probable killer in just one weekend. Joseph Clinton Mills, also known as Coach Joe, who had driven Linda Slatten's 12-year-old son Tim to and from practice. Authorities wanted to be certain before notifying the brothers. Moore's final 2019 report confirmed that Joseph Mills, then 58, was living in Kathleen, Florida, about half an hour from the crime scene. Detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley, the next generation of Lakeland investigators leading the Slatten cold case, reviewed the case and remembered seeing Mills' name in the files. Hathcock was thrilled to discover that Mills had been interviewed just one day after the murder, albeit briefly and only over the phone. The fact that investigators never questioned Mills face-to-face suggests he was never considered a suspect. During the brief call, Mills acknowledged he had driven Tim Slatten home from football practice on September 3rd, just hours before Linda Slatten was killed. The question remains as to why Joseph Mills was not followed up on more aggressively in 1981. Detective Tammy Hathcock explained that at the time of the initial investigation, Joseph Mills was just a football coach who had dropped off Timmy and was never on the radar as a suspect based on the information provided by Timmy and Mills himself. In 1984, Mills was convicted of grand theft for forging a will. Although he never went to jail, he was fingerprinted, and Lakeland police also took a palm print. In August 2019, investigators compared those prints to the palm print Sergeant Pickett had lifted from Slatten's windowsill nearly 38 years earlier and found a match. While genetic genealogy had identified Mills as the likely killer, and the palm print match helped confirm his identity, detectives Hathcock and Hurley still needed to compare a fresh DNA sample from Mills to the decades-old DNA recovered from the crime scene. They conducted surveillance to obtain Mills' discarded DNA without his knowledge. After several unsuccessful weekends of following Mills, the detectives decided to take his trash back to the police department. They found a piece of used medical adhesive tape and sent it to the FDL crime lab for testing. The detectives also investigated Mills' life, discovering that he had been married to the same woman, lived in the same place, owned a cleaning service business, worked as a truck driver, and had a family with children and grandchildren. 11 days later, the lab results confirmed that Joseph Mills' 2019 DNA found on the medical tape matched the 1981 unknown DNA from Linda Slatten's rape kit. The brothers were then informed that the monster had been found. Tim Slatten was shocked to learn that the killer was Coach Joe, whose picture he had kept in his house for years without a clue. The 1981 team football photo, which had once been a source of pride, now sickened him, as the man he once trusted and admired stood directly behind him in the picture. Even after the murder, Joseph Mills continued driving Tim to and from football practice, picking him up and dropping him off at his grandparents' house. Mills would ask Tim about the case, inquiring if there were any new leads or news. Tim, who was only 12 years old at the time, would simply reply that there was nothing new. Jeff and Tim were appalled that Mills, knowing he was the killer, would try to keep tabs on the murder investigation through the son of the woman he had murdered. On December 12, 2019, detectives Hathcock and Hurley arrested Joseph Mills. They noted that Mills was calm, cool, and collected during the arrest, showing no emotion or reaction, which was unexpected given the circumstances. During the police interview, Mills initially claimed that he had never been inside Linda Slatten's apartment, stating that when he picked up the boys, they stayed in the vehicle. The detectives knew this was a lie, as they had overwhelming evidence placing Mills inside Slatten's bedroom, including his fingerprints and DNA. As the detectives increased the pressure, Mills' story began to change. He claimed that Slatten had invited him inside for consensual sex and that she had a hanger around her neck when he entered through the window, asking him to tighten it as part of a sex game. The detectives believed this was a complete fabrication. Mills admitted to applying pressure to the hanger around Slatten's neck during the alleged sex game. Despite Detective Hurley pointing out the brutality of the hanger and how deeply it was embedded in Slatten's skin, Mills maintained his claim that it was part of a sex game. The detectives believed that Mills purposely killed Slatten and had targeted her. According to the detectives' theory, after dropping off Tim from football practice on September 3, 1981, Joseph Mills returned later that night and broke in through Linda Slatten's bedroom window. No one heard Mills because no one was home. Jeff was at his grandparents' house, and Linda and Tim were at the party next door. The detectives believe Mills hid in the closet waiting for Slatten to return. In the final moments of her life, Linda walked into her bedroom and closed the door, unaware that Mills was already inside. The detectives assert that there was no invitation or consensual sex. Joseph Mills raped and murdered Linda Slatten. Detective Brad Grice, who had always suspected the killer's name was buried in the case file, blames himself for not taking a harder look at Joseph Mills. However, the Slatten brothers feel nothing but gratitude towards Grice, who spent 17 years chasing the elusive killer. Jeff even named his son Brad in honor of the detective. Grice wanted to solve the case for the Slatten brothers more than anything. Former investigator Edgar Pickett, then 94 years old, also shared this sentiment. The brothers had always wanted to meet Pickett, and they thanked him for his work on the case, acknowledging that without his efforts, the monster would still be running free. Pickett lifted the palm print that helped identify Joseph Mills, and he considers the Slatten case one that he can never forget, as it remains in his mind to this day. During his 29-year career, Sergeant Pickett had seen it all, but the Linda Slatten case still haunts him. He was unaware that police had questioned Joseph Mills just one day after the killing. Instead of focusing on Mills, Pickett was asked to compare prints of several black men who were questioned in the days following the murder based on neighbors' reports of suspicious activity. This not only haunts Pickett but also angers him, as black men were rounded up and fingerprinted while the white football coach who drove Linda's son to and from practice was never considered a suspect. Pickett believes the case could have been solved in the first days after the murder if they had taken a print from Joseph Mills. However, detectives Hurley and Hathcock disagree, stating that there was no indication Mills had been in the house, and witnesses said he had dropped the kid off from practice without getting out of the truck. Mills was only spoken to because he was part of the 24-hour timeline before the murder. Joseph Mills' day of reckoning finally came 40 years later. To avoid a trial and a possible death sentence, he pleaded guilty to all charges, including first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary. At his sentencing, Linda Slatten's family wanted an answer to one question: why? Jeff Slatten yelled at Mills in court, asking why he took his mother from him when they were happy. Tim Slatten's blood would boil every time he looked at Mills. The brothers and Aunt Judy tried to look Mills in the eye to see if there was any humanity or soul in him, but never saw it. Mills' silence infuriated the family, and his comments to the court a few minutes later further angered them. During his sentencing, Joseph Mills claimed he was a good person and not the person they were painting him out to be. C.C. Moore found this case the most infuriating out of the hundreds she had been involved in due to what Mills did with Linda's children present, and his attempts to denigrate the victim, forcing her sons to hear those statements. The judge sentenced Mills to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he was gone, facing 4 life terms. While this was a measure of justice, the Slatten brothers felt it wasn't full justice, as they wanted Mills to go to trial and explain why he committed the crime, which he never did. The brothers find some comfort in knowing Mills will never leave prison alive, but still feel anger because he never took full responsibility for the premeditated rape and murder of their mother, never apologized, and had years of freedom. They feel they were handed a far more severe sentence: life without the possibility of growing up with their mom, who would only be 72 today if she were still alive. When asked if they were angry with how the police handled the case and the time it took to catch Mills, the brothers acknowledged the hard work that went on behind the scenes and the hours put in by the investigators, stating that one could get mad, but only so much could be done in a day. C.C. Moore emphasized the importance of the work done by the original crime scene investigators, who collected and stored the evidence responsibly and carefully for years, even before DNA was used in criminal investigations. Without their efforts, the case could not have been solved. Jeff and Tim are determined to move on as best they can, living life well for their mom and their families. They remain extremely close, living just a few miles apart and sharing passionate hobbies like restoring cars. They credit their ability to live this life to the spirit of their mom, believing she is looking down on them and wanting them to do good and make her proud. The Slatten brothers visit their mother's grave, and Jeff burns a candle next to a portrait of his mother every year on the anniversary of her death. Sergeant Edgar Pickett, who played a crucial role in the investigation, passed away in April 2023.